Hello, Brian Burley. Thank you so much for being here on another episode of The Makeup Historian. I appreciate you taking time out of your day to join me.
Yep, thanks for having me. I appreciate the opportunity to hop on your show.
Of course. So, the goal of the show is to preserve the beauty and blemishes of history, which really is a fancy way of saying it's a history podcast. Any topic goes. We're not going to shy away from anything. So, the reason I wanted to talk to you today is to get a little bit of a better insight into the political realities of today, which is a complex thing in general. But why don't we just get started with how you got into politics?
Well, I wasn't always going to get into politics. I've ran a few times now. I went to USC. I was where I graduated. I kind of got a little bit more involved there. Before then, I was at Cal State Fullerton, and I was pursuing a degree in computer science, and that lasted about a semester. Ended up eventually now having a IT consulting company, and I work in IT at the University of Southern California. So I didn't need the degree anyways. But after a semester sitting in a computer lab, I couldn't do that 20 hours a week sitting in a computer lab. It's just not for me. I didn't need it anyways. Obviously, I already got a job and my business already, you know, focuses on it. So I started doing business entrepreneurship and political science classes, transferred to USC doing political economy. And then that kind of, running for office came up relatively quickly in that process of something that I think I would have wanted to do. But I just didn't know where and how. And the whole public service thing came from years prior to that, though. And, kind of diving, you know, full forward and doing it was more of just, hey, realizing I didn't want to do another degree. My mother first moved out to California in 2007. She moved out here for cancer treatment at the City of Hope. She had 6 month diagnosis in Michigan, and she got 3.5 years at the City of Hope in California. After she passed away, I was lucky to have such a great family and support system, and my faith, of course, to rely on. So I was fortunate, but other people aren't as fortunate. So in terms of public service, that comes from that experience of wanting to give back to people that feel like they don't have a voice in government and that feel neglected in a way, right? And underrepresented.
Yeah, my heart goes out to you about your mom. I'm sorry about that. And thank you for sharing that part of your story. For those of you or those that are not familiar with you, what is the particular race that you're in right now? Kind of giving everyone a background.
Well, we don't really know because really specifics because they're redrawing the maps. I've been running in the 45th District of California, U.S. House Congress, and I've been campaigning since really about March. We started, hitting the ground running. But they redistrict every 10 years based off the census. So the numbers of the district change, the cities in the district change to make sure they have equal population. So right now, where I'm getting redistricted would be considered the 44th district, or at least that's what it shows on the maps. They could change the numbers, they could change the city still by the December 23rd deadline. So we're just waiting to see. Yeah,
Gotcha.
that's the plan. We feel really confident. The most recent map had it drawn pretty favorably. We should win our primary if we do our job and put in the work. And with a year like people think next year's going to be, as long as we put it out in the work and we outwork the whoever the Democrat ends up being. We don't know if Katie Porter is going to stay in 44 or go down to what is now 48, but would be 47 against Michelle Steele. We don't know what her
Mhm.
plan is, but either way, I think I can win that district if that's how the lines are drawn.
Yeah, I like that. Well, another reason that I asked you on the show was I had a chance to hear you speak in person, and you kind of stood out to me because you're one of the few millennial politicians I know of that actually explains what they stand for and stand against. I was like, that's refreshing. So, and that always catches my attention because during the Roman Republic, it was much more common for a politician to run on a campaign that told you what they stood against, not what they stood for. And I personally think a lot of Americans are done with that type of politician who just waves a flag for any cause, but never really tells you where they draw the line in the sand. So that brings me to my next two questions. We'll start with, the first one, what do you stand for, but also what do you stand against?
I always say that I'm pro-life, pro-constitution, pro-Second Amendment. Those are like the three, core values that I always exhibit when I do have a public speech. But I think with next year, with everything going on and where we're at politically as a country, critical race theory is not going away. That issue is going to play in primaries as well as generals. We just saw it in Virginia. And then you also have defunding the police, which kind of goes a little bit hand in hand because those are kind of those two social movements. I don't know if you can hear the birds, and my dog is trying to get on the
No,
screen.
you're
Sorry,
good.
everybody wants to distract me, including my dog. So defund the
No worries.
police and critical race theory are going to play a big role in the elections, as we saw in Virginia. In terms of myself, I'm the only Republican or one of three that voted for new leadership at the OCGOP back in January with the Central Committee. So the Central Committee, unfortunately, I don't think they should. They try to it's a room of 60 people usually that try to influence the elections by putting the little stamp of the Orange County Republican Party. It's lost a lot of its um, mystique because we keep losing. We've lost half our seats since 2015 when the current leadership took over. And my argument, when I was one of three that had enough internal fortitude to stand up, say we can't, I'm not going to vote for the current leadership again. Um, was enough was enough. It gets, people throw away the term, throw away the round that throw around the term rhino, and it's true to an extent because we've sold out a lot of our values. You see a lot of the candidates that they do endorse. Their endorsements don't really actually make a big deal, except with a small subset of voters, where that authenticity of that little badge on a flyer helps them. But there's so many groups now. What it's created is you have so many groups that endorse. You have so many different Republican groups. So, long story short, I've taken on the establishment. I have a backbone that's important, especially next year. Being the only candidate that's done that. I'm pro-life, pro-constitution, pro-Second Amendment, and I'm of course against the bad stuff, critical race theory, defunding the police. I'm pro-life as well, so I'm against some of the inhumane things happening to our youth. And if we lose the value for life, then we don't really have a society, in my opinion. So,
Gotcha. Yeah. No, thank you for sharing that. I appreciate it. Well, one of my other original questions was to ask you, what's going on in your district or what are the most pressing issues in your district? But as you just mentioned earlier, that's kind of a mess in a sense. So I'll transition and ask, what do you think is the biggest political issue in California?
well, I think California families are what are at the forefront of all of these issues. The biggest issue is, I mean, if you see like Tustin and a few other, you see all these recalls that are going on. Like the Newsom recall was just the beginning, and now you're seeing school boards, you see city councils where people are really fed up with their current leadership and they're trying to oust their current leadership. So critical race theory is still the top issue, at least for parents. For Californians as a whole, I still think it is the reaction to COVID mandates. Um, and I think that was we massively overreacted, and we've drawn this out for so long that now it is a very political issue where people are. There was a poll, I forgot what the poll was, but it was something like over 50% of Democrats and like 30% of Republicans thought you had a 50% chance of being hospitalized if you had COVID, which that's not true. You have less than a 5% chance of actually hospitalized.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so with the media, with the parties, there's been so much fear mongering. That issue isn't going away. People losing their businesses, like the ramifications of all of those decisions last year with the shutdowns are
Mm-hmm.
still here right in front of us, and you have inflation on top of that. So, but I think any election, any candidate running, next year's election is going to be fighting for the mothers and the fathers. Whoever gets those votes is going to win the election usually.
Yeah. Did that specific poll specify what age demographic they were talking about, or was it in
I'm
general?
sure it did. I'd have to go. It was a while back. It was maybe a month ago. I saw it. I can try to circle back and find it and send it to you. Um,
No
but
worries.
it just showed the difference between how much people are scared compared to the reality. And
Okay.
they had independent Republican, and I'm sure they had age breakdowns too.
Yeah.
Uh, but I'm sure if you're older, you might have since you're more likely to be impacted by COVID, you might think that number is naturally higher, right? Than it actually is. Like, someone my age, I'm 28. I know that number is small because if you take the whole population in the consideration and not just my own health, right?
Yeah.
But yeah,
Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier when you were talking about your education that you went to quite a few very liberal schools. So, what was your experience like I mean, have you always been conservative or were you conservative in college?
I've always been conservative. I was, in the college Republicans at USC
Oh,
for a brief stint. Um, that's not. I didn't feel like I could have much of an impact doing that. I started helping campaigns relatively quickly while I was in college. Um, yeah, I think one thing about USC. Well, now I think I agree, but when I went to USC, which as an undergrad was, as I graduated 5 years ago, I feel old now.
I
But like I guess
understand the feeling.
I would have started 7 years ago because I transferred. At the time, it was kind of like it was known that USC was more conservative than people like
Oh, it
let you
was.
know.
Okay.
Yeah, you got all the donors. You have, like I bet you at least half of the board, at least if they don't give to conservatives, they have vote Republican in a recent
Hmm.
3 or 4 elections. Whether they'd announced it or not, that's not public, but I'm just guessing.
Yeah.
So, Cal State Fullerton also is in Orange County, and I would say at the time it was more conservative than people thought. Uh, there's different aspects of each of those. I was allowed, I felt by the professors at Cal State Fullerton to be conservative, and the
Mm-hmm.
fact that I was, you know, often more willing to talk in class or something, or participate as a conservative. Um, there were while the like in an English class, people knew that I wanted to run. They were more indifferent about stuff
Yeah.
than
Okay.
than at USC where I would be silenced or by some professors or it would be maybe a situation where you'd have a student that was very just wants to get an argument. And I try to like talk to him and he just didn't want to actually have the conversation. You have that on the right side too. I had a similar situation actually at my hot tub in my condo not too long ago where a lady's conservative and she was pro-choice. And everybody was asking me about politics in the hot tub. I know that's a really weird situation to kind of imagine in your head, but they know I run, so I always hey, how's stuff going? And her point was, well, you can't. There's no reason that a man can be pro-life, or it's not their choice. And I said, you know, the American family system relies on two parents, so maybe you should take them both, regardless of your gender. Maybe we should at least listen to each other. And like almost half of women are pro-life. So what are you saying to those women that are also pro-life? They don't matter. They
Yeah.
they can get pregnant. So, but at the university, you don't have something like that. I actually like explained to that person, the situation of why I was pro-life and how it impacted society. But at a university, you don't always get that, and I'd be outnumbered 90% to 10% or worse in most political science classes. But I didn't, I only took a handful of political science classes. I mostly took econ. When I took business classes, those were conservative. The professors were conservative. They wouldn't say it, but they leaned at least fiscally conservative. So um, parts of it are overrated. I think the when I was at USC, there was an issue where I was pretty upset with the college Republicans helped a group put up these like flags on all the poles that were promoting a pro-life event, and students complained, and the school took them down.
Hmm.
And the club had paid for it, so I said, "Well, if that was a rainbow flag, they wouldn't have taken it down. So is the university gonna pay the club for the costs for the flag?" And no, and they were like, "No, they're not gonna do that." I'm like, they should because they're being biased. Um,
Hmm.
you know, so all those dynamics have only gotten worse. I work at a university now too, and be kind of careful what I say, I'm sure, but there's a lot of people that work at universities are off their rocker, I guess. The best that I have a lot of friends too that work at universities, but it's just the truth. Uh,
Okay.
I guess that's the best way to put it. They're off their rocker.
That's
Um, they just, and that's not the majority. I think there's a lot of liberal professors that feel like, and you've seen this with comedians going to universities where they don't feel welcomed anymore, right? Because they're getting screamed at, they're getting chairs thrown at them when they come to campus, and having the police called on them just for having telling jokes. Comedians, or Ben Shapiro, the tiniest little guy, which people always say I look like Ben Shapiro. I don't know about that, but uh, yeah, he's had the police called on him when he goes to speak at universities. Like, he poses no physical threat to anybody. Um,
yeah. Well, as a history professor, I have to ask, what were your history classes like? Did you take many of them? Or I'm guessing maybe only the required like GE ones or
when I was at Cal State Fullerton, I remember taking some world history class, but that was like we're working on almost 10 years uh, next. And it was my first
yeah.
semester, so I'd be lying if I said I was paying a lot of attention and I wasn't maybe farting around more than I should have been, because I think we all do that our first semester. We kind of enjoy the college life. It's your first time out of the house. And so I got to see my first semester. Honestly, I had to pull it together. And I got into USC. I went double time and got straight A's after that. But yeah,
Hmm.
my first semester I struggled, but it was all my own doing.
I totally understand that. I had no intention of going to college at all, and then now I'm still there. So
Oh yeah,
never left. But I understand what you're saying, and I think regardless of a professor's, especially historians' political leanings, that it's very obvious that conservative students are being censored on college campuses. Whether or not you are conservative, you kind of have to be living under a rock to not notice that. So that's why I try to bring it up into discussion, because I think you and I'm 29, so we were pretty much in the college system, right around the same time frame. And I think we were kind of the last group to really have any sense of normalcy before the whole Trump administration and the impact that that had on academia, because I see what my own students go through. Some of my students are very outright conservative, and it's very different from the experience that conservative students at my history departments as a student were going through. So I understand, but I try to bring conservative students into the discussion a little bit more, because I feel like they're being left out. And as an instructor myself, regardless of my own political or religious beliefs, I think it's an abuse of power and authority to project your own beliefs on your students. They should be able to think freely and speak freely in a college classroom.
yeah,
If you can't do that in America, then where can you? So anyway, I appreciate you sharing that, because it's not often that I get to talk to a you know, conservative, especially talk about their experience in college. So I appreciate that.
yeah, no problem. Yeah, it's now that I still work at USC, I've seen multiple angles of it.
Mhm.
Um, it's just kind of been interesting to see how things have gotten are kind of shifting even more towards censorship, and that's going to continue, I think, unfortunately.
Yeah.
Um, there has been some backlash. We've seen some people are having phones in their pocket. They're able to pull it out and record a professor saying crazy stuff. We've had professors having
Yeah. If a
that.
professor is focused on their job, which is to make their students a subject matter expert, and that's it, they really shouldn't have any problems.
I
But
agree.
that's just my own personal 2 cents on that. But when I was looking into having you on the show, I listened to a few other podcasts that you had been on, and some of the things you mentioned stood out to me. One of them being I forget exactly what show it was, but you talked about how something along the lines that a lot of people don't realize we're in the wild, wild west days of the internet. And I really liked that. I had never heard anyone put it that way. So what exactly did you mean by that? As a millennial, I'm curious about that.
Well, we're in the wild, wild west. It was unregulated, and there was a period of time where I think when it was unregulated, it was kind of fun. Like I remember when I was in high school and like Facebook started, and I moved out from out west to Reno at the time, and I lived it when even when I came to California too. You could look people up based off your high school, make friends online. It was more of a social tool. Um, but now it's like a political tool. And when it became a political tool slowly with Obama, the way he used it, but then Trump put it on steroids. Um,
Yeah.
and there's like two competing arguments, like those companies that own the platforms, they they own that landscape to some degree. Uh, can they censor you? How much can they censor you? Kind of like yelling fire in like a movie theater, right? Like you're not supposed to do that. So there are limits on things, but there's also, um, I mean, we just saw a U.S. rep post a anime video of himself doing crazy things to AOC and to Biden, which I didn't. I thought was, I don't know if you saw Gosar's video, but it got taken down and it got censored over it. So, um, all this stuff, you know, our morals and our thought process is getting challenged constantly. Then you've had people back to the university part of it, and this goes hand in hand with social media. I always butcher his name, so please apologize or please take my apology. But you don't need to apologize. Milo Yielopanilos, I think I pronounced his name. I don't know if you know Milo. It might be Milo. I think it's Milo. He was this guy who would go to campuses, a gay conservative, and he would just say stuff about people like just to fire them up. And that's what it is on social media too. Like that's what social media has become. Uh, and running for office, I've had a few years ago when I was in a relationship with my girlfriend at the time and my grandparents. We went out to eat at the pier in Huntington Beach, and I had like one person, actually one family, I should say, husband and wife, had 7 or 8 profiles, and they kept asking me a question. I said, "Hey, I'll answer you. I'll give you all the time I have after I get dinner with my family. I'm sorry." Started attacking me. I said, "All right, you know what? Never mind. I'm not going to give you that luxury. You're done." Went through 7 or 8 accounts of them doing that blocking. Because at that point, I felt like I said, "I'm done talking to you. This is my personal account. Still, I'm a candidate. I'm not an elected official. Even if you're an elected official, I do think you have some rights to block people if you're being harassed. I do believe that people don't always like that. They think you're in the public eye, so you're just open for Mike Tyson punches left and right, but you're not to some degree. If you ask people to leave you alone, um, your messenger isn't an open forum. It's not a town hall. It's not. I know some people don't like that, but that's what I mean. And we're in the wild west of it, where people think unregulation means
Mm-hmm.
you're available 100% of the time, when it's like people have lives at the end of the day. And then, the Trump 2016, where they tried to blame it all on Russia with the ads, that's changed everything for a campaign from my angle. When it comes to having to run ads, the hoops you have to jump through, like to run ads, are much higher than any hoops you ever have to vote. So, there's these standards that don't match up. Like you have to run an ad on Facebook. I haven't done it in a while. They might change it again. You have to get a disclaimer. Obviously, it says paid for by. In my case, it says paid for by Brian Burley for Congress. So
Mm-hmm.
you apply for it. You send them a picture of your ID. You send them a phone number so they can send you a text. And then remember this, they send you something in the mail that has a code. So that way you can dial the code back in 10 days later after you get it in the mail. And then they review it. And then they say, okay, you get to run ads. Like that was the reaction to 2016. And now they're making further changes where Google did it a few years ago. You used to be able to take a CSV file where you'd have like people's phone numbers, addresses, email, and you just target those people. You wouldn't target everybody in your district with a certain message. But Google said this is kind of discriminatory, which I don't agree with. It's called targeting, like a business. Like you can target certain groups. Well, Facebook's getting rid of some of their targeting algorithms. Right now, they allow you just to target what they consider as conservative voters. That's going away. So we're in this process. Long story short, I know I'm kind of rambling, but where it's the wild west of like these companies are navigating without regulation. I think in that podcast I suggested that these companies should be required to disclose how they're using data, specific data to the user on the platform, like send them a report, send them, who they're selling their data, not well if they are selling their data, but also who they're selling the advertisement space that they see um, to, and how even the prices that what your time is worth to those companies, right? So,
Yeah.
but we're all in the wild west of this, and I think we need people in Congress that are willing to um, ask those questions. I remember a couple of years ago when Zuckerberg was being questioned by a few congressional leaders, and they kept asking him how they make money. He said, "Well, we run ads." I know, but really, how do you make money? Like, we run ads, and like we're still in that frame of thought where we have people and I don't mean this as a slight. I work in IT. I deal with this every day. We have a lot of congressional leaders there. I don't know if they know how to check their email, let alone how Facebook, is operated. Like, it's just that's the honest truth, the blunt
I
truth.
would agree with that. Yeah.
So we're in a transition. I think after Trump and Biden, we're not going to have the same age range of leadership because I think you're going to have maybe people more in the Mark Cuban range that try to run for office after this, start a little bit younger, but are still business minded. I think that's where it's going to go after whatever happens in 24 or maybe 28. Like eventually, like people are going to say like Bernie Sanders is too old to be president. Like when he's 90, maybe it's when they're 90. When he's 90, they're like, all right, enough. Like
Tapping out, cutting it off.
yeah. Like I don't know though. I don't know where that line is. But
Yeah.
in Congress, at least, where you're questioning people, you're doing oversight. Like you need people that actually understand the concepts. So
Well, maybe that's a good transition. What are your thoughts on term limits? Because we
I've
have,
always supported term limits. I signed the U.S. term limits pledge. I believe their pledge is for 3 terms in the U.S. House. I'd sign the pledge, but I actually believe in more of a firmer. Um, Really, the only thing that and people don't agree with me. That's fine. They don't have to agree with me on 100% of everything. The one thing that was really good over the last 20 years in California was the term limit rules, which are, I believe they're 12 years between both legislative bodies. So back in the old days, you could just stay as long as you wanted. If you have 12 and they only have to be consecutive. If you have consecutive rules on limits, which is what you have in a lot of local cities, I don't like those either. Like you should have firm term limits. Once you're done, you're done. You go do something else with your life. But 12 years in the U.S. House and U.S. Senate combined, you can't do 12 in each. I thought was a good idea. That's what you have in California between the state assembly and state senate. That's not the pledge I signed. The pledge I signed was a little bit more strict, but for simplicity's sake, saying, "Oh, we know they have 12 years, no matter what." That's like two U.S. Senate terms, or math. What is it? It's 6 U.S. House terms. So and you could do, if someone wanted to switch back and forth, they could do 6 years in the House, 6 years in the Senate that way. But I don't think the founding fathers ever intended for people to be there for 20, 30 years. I have respect for all elected officials. I said in a debate recently, I said, I don't want to be Dana Rohrabacher. I don't want to be standing here in 30 years. Like, I don't want to be in Congress for 30 years. I don't. I mean, I'm 28. Ideally, we win next year. I serve, you know, uh, immediate over the next decade amount of time. And, hopefully when I'm 38, I have a family and I can focus on that, right? That would be the ideal thought, but how life always works. But yeah,
yeah.
that's my perspective on term limits.
Well, I appreciate that. As a historian, I'm very weary of career politicians, not a fan on both sides of the aisle. I think at a certain point you lose touch with the public, especially if you're in there that long. You're there for your career. You're not there for your constituents, and you're not really paying attention to what your constituents need. So I think there needs to be a little bit more of a turnaround here. So I appreciate that. I do.
Yep.
And that kind of brings me to my last question, kind of following up on something you just said. This is honestly one of my personal favorite questions to ask anybody. But do you really think our founders would be proud of us today?
No.
Why is that?
uh, I think we veered off the beaten track a little bit, radically, on both sides of the aisle. I'm not trying to be a hack for my current party. I mean, I think the two most recent major world events, and at least in my, you could say three if you want to include the Middle East wars that we've had, but I'm thinking 9/11 and this pandemic, how much we're willing to give up our rights and how much, people are willing to, we saw with the Patriot Act. I think we all understand, okay, we're going to an airport. We don't want planes going into buildings anymore. So we're going to allow ourselves to be x-rayed, to go through metal detectors. I think we all understand that. Like that 15-minute convenience every time we go. It can be longer if you're at LAX, I guess. But that inconvenience is agreeable by most people, including myself, because that we don't want that to ever happen again.
Mm-hmm.
Now, a pandemic is not the same in that. And what resulted from that was, the Patriot Act, looking at people's personal files, taking webcams like this and watching people and recording people on their phones and all these other awful things that, might have been happening before, but they were outwardly put into, in the public. And now you see with the COVID response, it started with, just pretty much shelter in place for 2 weeks. that was the
Yeah.
get toilet paper if you can, get groceries, and
Yep.
stay at home with your family. It was like, hey, government's paying you for a vacation, and that quickly has turned into like, you know, um, harassment if you don't want to get vaccinated or if you want to exhibit a different choice. I've dealt with some of this personally, even though I have a religious exception at my employer, where it's like that they're going to continue to get worse. They're going to start trying to make the employees pay for probably really expensive testing. They're going to do like all these things that try to get you to get vaccinated. And how much are we willing to give up? Um, and what is the Patriot Act of the pandemic?
Good question.
Have we already seen it? Is it the mandates, or is it much bigger than that? Is it a collection of all of our health records into one system, which apparently they have with the vaccine? I have a friend in hospital that says they have a system where they have all everybody's vaccine records based off the number that's on. I don't
Wow.
know if that's true, but that's what I've been told. Um,
Hmm.
so is it that it's appropriate to ask you about your health in public now? Is that like, you
Where
know,
did HIPAA go? That's what I want to know.
what's
Like,
up?
what happened to HIPAA?
Yeah, I mean the people have a little bit of. I work in IT, and we have some servers that used to deal with HIPAA. So some people, I actually had a family member that was arguing with me, like, how do they know what percent of people are vaccinated because there's HIPAA? And I'm like, well, that doesn't actually mean that they're violating HIPAA because,
Hmm.
I mean, they have a certain number of doses. If they use a certain number of doses, they know people are vaccinated, right? Like a certain number, like that's just a math. That's not a HIPAA complaint, I don't think. But if they were using that data and then coming up with those numbers, they were looking at everybody's personal medical files. Yeah, that is a violation, even though they're doing it for statistical reasons. So I think it'll be much bigger than HIPAA.
Hmm. I
Um,
agree with that.
I don't know what it'll be. I don't know if it'll be, uh, to get into USC right now. Um, Now, I'm relatively young. There's a video game I played before, and I'm going to go off the rails a little bit here called The Last of Us, where it's about a pandemic, and they turn into zombies, and they scan the back of their head before they can continue into this society in this game, and they get
Oh,
executed if they're positive. I don't think we're going to get to that point, but even to get into USC, you have to have a barcode on your phone. You have to check in, do a check. You have to get tested. You have to do questionnaires, and you
oh
just
my
end up,
God.
yeah, and they scan it. Um,
I
and
did not know that.
Yeah, I got harassed last week um, because I went on vacation to go. I was going to go watch the NASCAR championship in Arizona. I took two
Mhm.
vacation days. Well, I was told that weekends, I was told inaccurately that weekends don't count on your, like, you have to get tested. At the time it was 7, now it's 3 days I have to get tested. So I was like, well, I'm going to be tested on Thursday, coming in on a Tuesday. So they said, well, you should be fine because you have Friday, Monday, and then Tuesday is your third day. I'm like, so weekends don't count. And they said, yeah, that wasn't the case. So I drove in. I couldn't log in to this app to scan
Oh,
in. And then they said, you need to go over in this line. Said, where's your vaccine card? I'm like, don't have one. I got an exception. You can't come into campus. And I said, I'm coming into campus. Like, I have to get tested. I'm going to go park and I'm going to go get tested. Like, you can't come into campus. Whatever you do, you can't come into campus. I said, cool. I'm going to go park and I'm going to go get tested on campus. I didn't say on campus, but obviously, like, and he is recording the whole conversation. I'm like, this is so wrong. I felt harassed. I sound maybe like I'm triggered, but like I did. I felt harassed. This is none of your business. Anyways, this random guy that works the security gate, who's probably, been put to this for whatever reason. But that's just the beginning of it, because what if that starts at other businesses? What if that becomes um when I went to DC about 3 months ago or so to meet with some groups, talk about my campaign, see if I could get their help and support. But when you go from Virginia to DC, it's like two different countries. It really is, like with the way they handle the vaccine and mandates and masks and everything. And the same things for Orange County and LA County. I feel like I'm going into like a confinement base when I like enter the LA County line in Long Beach. Like it's nuts. Like that there's
yeah.
such like polar opposites in how we react to things from Huntington Beach to Long Beach and of course, LA County. I think Long Beach is actually more lax than downtown LA, which is like still acts like we're in the middle of like a surge when we're not. So that's where I found. Sorry, that's a long answer for all of that, but the founding fathers would look at the most recent events, and maybe stuff in the past like Watergate. They would maybe roll their eyes about compared to some of these things that are going on right now, because someone said it recently. I forgot where I read it. It was or heard it. It was on a podcast that if Watergate happened now, uh, it'd be covered in the morning and you know it would be off the news cycle by noon, because like just what
Wow.
our standards have changed so much. I thought about that and it's like, yeah, some of the stuff that like some of these people do is so sketchy and like it might be right. Um, and like COVID's not going to be the last world emergency we have probably in the next 20 years. So like as things happen. Uh, I was watching the news the other day, and this is just a sidebar, real quick, but they were talking about deer getting COVID now, and they're worried about that coming back and mutating back into the human race, which is totally like there's no evidence of that, but the media was like putting this out there, like as if like, and I'm like, why are you even like discussing this, like and scaring people now about deer? And then they're gonna blame all the people that go hunting. Watch that they're the COVID spreaders, because that's what the article said.
Yeah.
It said, I think this was on CNN. It said that like humans had given deer um, COVID-19. So I'm guessing the only contact between deer and humans is hunting, right? Like unless they have them maybe some people have them as pets, but like so this is the pandemic isn't going to change. They're gonna try to like react crazy about every sickness now and stop the world when somebody
Mhm.
has bronchitis. So I think that's what we're
Yeah,
going.
I agree. I would agree with you on, almost everything you said, but especially that I don't think our founders would be proud of us at all, with how we've handled this. And obviously, there was a facet of it that was unprecedented, not all of it, just a facet. But still, I think they would be most disappointed with us in how we have let government get too powerful. We have willingly given up so many of our civil liberties that so many have paid the ultimate price for. And I think that would probably be the number one thing that they would just be like, what you have forgotten what it means to be an American. You've forgotten your values. And especially Jefferson, perhaps. I think he might be the most upset at us because he warned us about that. He did. He said, and especially in regards to education about the Constitution, our founders also warned us about the importance of continuously studying the Constitution and making sure that our population knew about it. And I know firsthand that many of my own students, and I teach college, when they first get to my class, never read it. Have absolutely all they know is we the people. That's it. And that's I think that should be a huge wake up call to America that our students, our kids, adults don't know the Constitution. We're willingly giving up civil liberties. To me, this is bigger than, oh, I'm Republican, I'm Democrat. It's so much more than that. And I think people need to realize there's common ground and that those first three words, we the people, that is exactly what tells you who the sovereign is of America, the
Mhm.
people, not government, not politicians. So that's why I'm always weird. I mean, my own students know I'm always very cautious of any politician, no matter what their party is. I don't care. All I want to know is, are you listening to your constituents and are you defending the Constitution? That's it. That's what it comes down to.
That's how it should be. I know that like when I met at that one event, um, sort of what down in it was down in Irvine, right? I believe it was down in Irvine.
Oh yeah,
Um,
yeah, that. Mm-hmm.
and I always kind of find it interesting to hear the different candidates speak and what their talking points are. And I made it a point to say I'm going to join the House Freedom Caucus because I won't, we put it out publicly on my page now too. But wanted to make that clear about where I stand. I stood. I think the House Freedom Caucus is most closely aligned to strict interpretation of the Constitution than any other coalition in DC. Um, but I've met with so many elected officials, state, local, federal, had some really awful meetings, admittedly, because they're different behind closed doors than they are in person. And I don't like that. I'm the same
Yeah.
person that I am, when I'm at the dog park with my dogs and I'm meeting with my consultants, when I'm talking to constituents, I'm usually the same person. Unless someone was coming at, trying to attack me, I would just listen, admittedly. Like that would be my approach. I would just listen to them. Like, I'm not going to convince you. Some people you just deal with in certain ways. You just listen to them because that's really what they want. They want they want to be heard. I get that. Other people, they want you to engage them. So
Mm-hmm.
that's part of, like you said, caring about your constituents and fighting for them.
Mm-hmm. That's what it should be. But
Yep.
apparently, I'm like, it's really simple here, guys. I don't think we have to get too crazy with it. Well, I do actually have one more final question, but this
Okay.
is just my own curiosity. If you could ask a historian to research anything, what would it be and why?
A good question. Um, hmm, that's a really good question. Historian or research anything. Um, I know this is like kind of like the political side of me, but I think something that's really been secretive between all the different presidents when they like leave office. And this could just be anything politically. It's more like a political, but this would be a history aspect that we don't have a lot of information on is the background communication between candidates
Mm,
and or elected officials of differing parties or when they're leaving, like when Reagan gave it to Bush and Bush gave it to Clinton. Like there's like a big discussion about how Bush wrote Clinton like a letter and put it on his desk. Like, how is that transition of power handled? Um, and then even more broader, like, in Congress, I've been to DC, like, how has that changed over time? Because people talk about like the 90s and like how Democrats and Republicans used to sit down and like have like lunch. Um, but that doesn't really occur anymore, I don't think, in DC. I think there's a lot more division. So studying those differing background communication would be something I think a historian needs to dive into more. What's the term in college that they always try to use, which is just like a college term that they throw around, they throw around, but it's like a political polarization. People go to their sides, but they talk about like the 80s and 90s where like people would like regardless of party, they'd go out to dinner, they'd get drinks, like. But I don't think that's the case now. Like, there's not
No.
been like a real deep dive into that and how that's changed and how does that communication actually happen. Um, and when I go to DC, like, it seems like there's like people don't know other members, like,
Oh,
to
that's
some
interesting.
extent. Like, even in the same party, I think like not everybody knows everybody. I think they know a lot, but and there is hundreds of members, so given that, like, you know, most of us can't remember every person we run into. So, but if you work, but they don't work that often though, all the time either. So that's another issue. Maybe that's why they don't know all their names. But uh,
Touche.
uh, so a look into those relationships and the transition of power. At least it's not been documented very well, I don't think, and there's probably more there
Mhm.
that gives you a different opinion about history than people would have otherwise thought. I know that like our media back when Trump took over for Obama used to talk about how Obama was like trying to get Trump to keep Obamacare, right? Like that conversation happened. Like outside of like, hey, he tried to do it. Like, what was actually said? Like,
Yeah, the exact words. What happens?
I think that kind of stuff should be like required to be recorded and like disclosed. Like, just for like, um, there's a podcaster, I think his name is Patrick Bet David, who wants Trump and Obama just to work together, just to bring people together. He wants them to like do like a discussion, not a debate, but like just a discussion where because he thinks that if they were able to at least meet, maybe not agree, that would like help heal some of the wounds. I don't know if that's true, but when you look at like George W. Bush and like Bill Clinton and like Obama and these other people, they handle like stuff differently compared to like Trump. So like another aspect of history, like did that change just with Trump? And there's been a different range of politicians that have been elected since Trump. I always say this, that like you can't run by the rules of 2012 anymore. Like, being a career politician is not like a favorable like campaign message, right? Like, I did this and I did that on my local board and I did this and like no one cares. Like, they don't want that anymore.
Yeah.
So like seeing that dynamic change and how that, because I think those people that are like business owners that are now in Congress are like been appointed to things, they might not have really close relationships with all the people that are elected officials because they just come from different backgrounds. One other thing, and this is just someone told me, and I don't know if this is accurate, but they told me that 80% of Congress is made up of lawyers. I don't know if that number is accurate. I don't know the exact employment background of all of them, but I would believe it. Then they said, I like you, Brian, because you're not a lawyer. And we have enough lawyers, and that's why we have such a mess. So listen, I don't hate lawyers. Let me be very clear about that. Very good lawyers out there, but if you have too much of one profession in Congress, that's an issue.
Yeah.
You should have some diversity. So uh, historians could look into that change over time. How has that changed? Have we, back when the founding fathers were around, I don't think they were a majority of, well, I would assume a majority of Congress people that worked in DC weren't lawyers. Um,
A good chunk of them were, but then there was also quite a few military guys. So
yeah, I just wonder how it's changed over time, right? No one ever talks about that kind of stuff. It kind
that's
of
a
changed. It talks
question.
about the way it, because that has a major factor on the way our government works. If you have like maybe a 40% compared to 80% lawyers, like, AOC is the lone bartender there. So like imagine if you had 80% bartenders running DC. Like the madness that you'd have.
Mhm.
The overpouring would be crazy. No, I'm just kidding. But like really but like it's an interesting concept of how that's changed over time. And
Yeah.
no one ever has really done the deep dive of history into any of those things, I think.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with a lot of scholarship on that, but it's a good point and something that I'm now very curious about. I want to look into myself. So I'm like, yeah, a good chunk now as I'm thinking about it, there are quite a good chunk that are lawyers. So like what is that percentage? And throughout all of the different phases, all the decades of our history, how many? So I'm
Yeah.
curious. I like that. I like that one. Thank you.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Brian, for talking with me today on the Make a Historian. I really appreciate it. And to conclude, how can people find you on social media? How can they get in contact with you and see what you're up to?
Instagram and Twitter is just Burley for the number four Congress. Website's brianburley.com. That's Brian with an I, Burley. So that's got most of my information. My phone number is on the website if anyone ever wants to reach out, as well as my email address. So we're pretty responsive.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
Yep. Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.